Hi, and welcome to RBP on JSB. I'm violinist Rachel Barton Pine, and today we're going to be discussing the third movement of Bach's Sonata No. 1 in G minor, which is the Siciliana in B-flat major. By the way, if you want to hear some thoughts about all of the issues that pertain to all of the sonatas and partitas, be sure to watch the overview episode. So what is a Siciliana? It's a kind of dance, actually. It's interesting that of Bach's 3 unaccompanied sonatas, the other 2 third movements are entitled Andante and Largo. They're just slow movements. So is this one a dance? Well, not really. It sort of uses a dance form, but transformed into an aria. So I don't think we're supposed to play it as if it could be danced to, unlike the dances in the partitas. The type of dance of the Siciliana, it's a little bit like a slow jig. If you think about a Scottish jig, which has dotted rhythm, so this is the same thing, except obviously quite a bit slower. So, in fact, what we should do to get used to this dotted rhythm is maybe a B-flat major scale, because it's really not supposed to be square, like 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3. It's supposed to have just the littlest bit of swing or lilt, not over dotting. It's not double dotted like, because that would make it too spiky. But it's just like a relaxing of the rhythm. It's hard to put into words, and you certainly can't notate it on the page. But if you just think of basically de-emphasizing that 16th, so it's not its own gesture, dun, 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 but dun, da, dun, dun, da, dun, dun, 1, da, and 1, da, dun. So let's do a scale. And watch the bow distribution. These notes have a lot of sweep. This one is tucked in without a separate emphasis. And then this little guy at the end with a little lift. So you're probably more familiar with Sicilians than you might think you are. The opening movement of the Drevel's Trill Sonata. Where's my fifth? Chords there. Okay, so that's, and of course this one. Silent Night, which of course would be slurred. But it's still a Sicilian with slurs. So that's the Sicilian for you. Now what's interesting is that sometimes because of that swing, then when we do have a note in the middle of the dotted rhythm, the 2/16, so if we have one voice going 8th, 8th, and the other voice is going dotted 8th, 16th, then we would essentially have run, pony. But it's not going to be 8th, 16th because of the fact that the other dotted, that the actual printed 16th is a slight different rhythm. So measure 5, for example, the first beat, and the bottom voice is going, you would not have da-dum-bum-bum. You would have something like, so da-dum-ba-dum, almost like a little triplet-y, but again, that, it's not an exact anything, but just slightly uneven. Here's another one. Another one in measure 9, third beat. And of course measure 17, which is really interesting because it's separate notes, but it should not sound like 4/16. But see, because the bottom voice is going, so that we still have that lilt regardless of what's going on with the polyphony. couple of places where Bach actually doesn't beam things with the voices belonging to the same beaming that you would think they would. In measure 12, it looks like the bottom voices and the top voices, but it really makes more sense to think of it like. So here I would still have a little bit of that middle eighth lilt. So, and the same thing with measure 13, which is really as if it was in the third beat, except he has this E flat, kind of like a written out appoggiatura. So it wouldn't be with this even rhythm, which you could still play elegantly, but it's not the right kind of Sicilian gesture anymore. It has to be. So you see the 16ths are just ever so slightly uneven. Now that brings us to the issue of bowing. How should we bow this opening little melodic fragment, the dum ba dum ba da da da. The da 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 is clearly phrasing away. And therefore the first beat is actually going to the second beat. Dum ba dum ba da da da. Feels really good to put the second beat on a down bow. But then what do we do with the first beat? Just like we don't want to, be hooking all the time in the second movement, we really don't want to be hooking all the time in the third movement unless we're planning to play in a romantic way, which is a perfectly legitimate option, but it wouldn't be Baroque-ish if you did that. Those kinds of hooks, you can make it tasteful, but it just doesn't feel as good. So starting up bow, people didn't start down bow as, sort of adamantly as they did later on. Back in the Baroque era, you might have heard of rule of the down bow, but that's really just for section orchestra playing. For solo music, it was just as acceptable to start up bow. If that worked better, which in this case it does, then you're right. If you start down bow and go separate, then you're really in trouble. I guess you could take another up here. But really, starting up bow is the best solution. Might seem a little bit bizarre when you're not used to such things, but it's actually perfectly logical and feels great. Now, what do you do when you have all of these things sort of piled on top of each other, starting in measure 9? So, first of all, he doesn't put in the slurs. Actually, leaving off the slurs solves the whole problem of bowing. And you can make them legato. But I don't know. Maybe one day I'll come around, but I really do like the slurs. I kind of miss them, so I love going. So then I'm backwards for half of them. And then, oh look, Bach did put in this slur in measure 11. So that's kind of my argument for putting the rest of the perhaps missing ones back in. You could argue the other side of the coin. You could say that because Bach deliberately wrote one and didn't write the others, that must mean that we really should follow what he said and make the others separate and that one slurred. And in fact, I use that exact argument in other movements for other issues, that, because he wrote only a slur over here, therefore the rest must not be slurred, otherwise he would have written them too. Who knows? We can't ask him, unfortunately. It would be kind of interesting to keep them all separate. Then just this one, but then you're backwards. You could take another up bow, but if you just do it as it comes, then you actually come out correctly with the slurs. See, it comes out correctly. correctly. Of course, you got to start 9 down bow, which is different than what I suggested for the very opening, but that's because of where you're coming out of. Because it's both the first note of this section as well as the last note of the previous section. And you do want to end down bow because ending up bow just wouldn't feel good there. I don't know. But it's something to play around with. I just like starting the very first one up bow because it's the first time you've heard that melodic fragment, and so having it phrased really nicely with the down bow on the 16th just feels so good. The texture of this movement is imitating a chamber ensemble that was the most popular chamber ensemble in the Baroque era, the Trios Sonata. The string quartet had not even been invented yet. They didn't exist till later as, the popular ensemble that they are, that they have been ever since. Trio sonata didn't mean 3 people, it meant 3 voices. So your continuo might be 1 or 2 or more people. So it's always funny when you play trio sonatas with 4 people, the audiences get very confused. But anyway, it meant 2 treble voices, which could be, 2 flutes and then a bassoon for your bass voice, or 2 violins and a cello, 2 flutes and a viola da gamba plus harpsichord. Whatever it is, it's 2 trebles kind of in duet as a pair, and then 1 bass voice. And that's exactly what we have here. Here's your cello starting off. And then your twin violins. That's from a Dr. Seuss book. I forget which one. And then your bass voice, violins, cello. And then here the cello with the violin, cello again. So they're having a whole dialogue back and forth. Really helpful to play one voice on its own to kind of understand the note shapes and note lengths and stuff. Oh, that's not the bass voice. And the middle of 4 concludes your first big statement. So that's the cello part for the first 3.5 measures. And then you've got your little fragments from the violin. Lovely. So, sometimes Bach's beaming isn't exactly kosher in terms of what you think the voices must be, and then you have to decide, well, did he really want things kind of twisty and not what you would expect, or was he just kind of beaming it and just made a mistake? He was not completely devoid of mistakes, even though the guy was a genius, and his batting average was far higher than normal, but, he got one wrong every once in a while. So to understand the trio sonata, the best thing to do is to actually see some trio sonatas. You may have gone your whole life thus far and never yet experienced a trio sonata. You've probably played lots of string quartets, maybe some piano trios, maybe a string trio, but very different animal, the later string trio, to this texture of a bass voice being a very separate thing, and then the 2 treble instruments always in duet. So get yourself some Corellis, get yourself some Handels, look at the score, or better yet, grab a couple friends and play them. 2 violins and a cello. Just play through some trio sonatas. Get the sense of the genre, because you're not going to know what to imitate if you don't know anything about that thing that you're imitating. So get used to trio sonatas and then be a one-man band in this Sicilian movement. And by the way, if you are being that cellist, the question is what to do about fingerings. Should you try to give it that cello depth by keeping it on the G string? That kind of, or I guess it's a 3-3. That's a very popular fingering that kind of goes back to the Galamian edition. But really, your cellist would not have been shifting around all on one string. Your cellist would have just been playing across the strings an octave down. So it's a little more natural to also play across the strings. And, how far do you take this? Of course, there's all kinds of places where you would have to do quite bizarre fingerings to keep it on the G string, though, I can understand measure 11 as opposed to, I don't know. It's up to you, but it certainly, by the way, would not have been a historically informed thing to do all that shifting around to retain a single color. You would just, play the voice with a certain amount of depth or weight, and that would make it a cello, and the others would be lighter and sweeter, and that would make them violins. You wouldn't have to try to do, single string playing. Single string playing didn't really become a thing until Paganini, and even as late as Joachim, Brahms's collaborator, Joachim was complaining and really protesting Wilhelmi playing a Bach orchestral movement all on the lowest string, what we now know as the famous error on a G string and think of as a Romantic era thing to do. Even one of the greatest violinists of the Romantic era, Joseph Joachim, said, "What is Wilhelmi doing to Bach? He's messing it up. He shouldn't play it all on the G string." So if Joachim said that about Wilhelmi, maybe you should reconsider playing the opening of the Sicilian all on the G string. Now this piece, of course, is in big 4, and each of the big 4 beats is separated into a 3-beat, rhythm. So 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3. But as is often happens in movements that have 3s, sometimes it breaks up into big 3, what we call a hemiola. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, it goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or a better way to say it would be 1 and 2 and 3 and. So you go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1 and 2 and 3 and 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This happens 3 times. One of them is the first half of measure 4, then another in the first half of measure 8, and lastly in the second half of measure 18. So to think of those big 3 beats as you're choosing your bowings and you also, more importantly, your emphases. So it's not 1 and 2 and, but 1 and 2 and 3 and 1. So not 1 and 3, or 1, 2, 3, 1. That's not a 1 anymore. It's only an and. Isn't that nice? It's just so fun to kind of have one of those thrown in there. Makes it really interesting and fun. Measure 8. And then the last one, measure 18. That one, you can use your own judgment. I think measure 4 is inarguable. Measure 18, I could see it either way. Maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 1. But, I always think, when in doubt, if it could be a hemiola, but maybe isn't, but if it could be, then do the hemiola, because heck, anything that's going to lend variety is always the better choice. But if you really aren't feeling it and really don't believe it, then, don't worry about it. I think the one in measure 8 is also pretty sure that it should be, because of the dissonance here and the missing upper voice here and then the big chord here. He's giving you all these clues that it should be 1 and 2 and 3 and, because 1 and 3 or 1, 2, 3 just doesn't make as much sense once you start to think about it. There are a couple of nice harmonic things going on in this movement. There are a couple of surprising chords towards the end. Now, after you've been practicing the movement long enough to perform it, you've put in hundreds of hours of time into this music, and nothing is a surprise for you anymore. But you have to put yourself in the shoes of the listener and think about, what do they expect to happen, and is what they're expecting actually going to happen? And if not, then you have to play it in a way that's showing them, hey, here's a surprise. So measure 15, you might expect for it to resolve, and instead it doesn't. Whoa, there's a really surprising harmony. And by the way, another bowing interesting thing in the beat before it, normally there would be always a slur on that bit of the little melodic fragment that goes around this movement. Here he left off the slur, and in this case I feel like, it's kind of nice to leave it off because it gets me to my down bow. And then I'm ready for this surprising chord. But I would totally understand if you feel like, well, why am I going to do it just that one time without the slur? It feels weird to do it separate. So, and I indeed did it separate for many, many years, that in the second beat of 15. So third beat of 15, surprising chord. Third beat of 17, even more surprising chord. So here, nice B flat major, and then suddenly, like, whoa, it's a happy surprise. It's not one of these like shocking minor key things that comes out of nowhere, but it's still a left turn that you need to really bring out for your listener. And of course, there's a couple of cadences. We discussed the minor key cadence at measure 9, which is kind of the midpoint of the movement. The real ending of the movement is measure 19. And the rest of it is almost, it's not long enough to be a coda. It's just kind of a little tag. And then, oh boy, here we have more missing slurs. What are we going to do? I just do them because they're not nearly as sweet without them, and I want sweetness at the end. So one last thing about harmonies. This note in, let's see if I can find it, measure 9. A lot of people over the years have played an F sharp, and then they continue playing F sharps because they hear other people playing F sharps, and it kind of proliferates that way. I'm talking about beat 3, of course. That kind of augmented second. But in fact, the F natural does indeed work modally. And, it's not like that definitely wrong note in bar 3 of the first movement that has to be an E flat. This F natural, Bach didn't write a sharp, and the F natural does work. So in this case, because it does work, we shouldn't superimpose something else that also does work, but, let's do what Bach wrote. When in doubt, stick with the print. And in fact, now when I listen to the F sharp, it actually sounds kind of wrong. I think sometimes when we hear the F natural and think it sounds wrong, it's not that it sounds wrong, it's that we're so used to the F sharp it sounds different and we're not used to it. But play the F natural for a while, get used to it, and you'll wonder how you ever could have not done it. And if you've never played this movement, just start with the F natural and never look back. Well, those are some of my thoughts about the Siciliana in B flat major from Bach's first sonata. I'm Rachel Barton Pine, and thank you for listening to RBP on JSB.